Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of DCKAP's Driven podcast. They say that you surround yourself with very, very smart people and you also get smart. So I'm very excited today because we have with us Mark Dancer, the CEO of Network for Business Innovation and also a NAW Fellow. Mark, I enjoyed meeting you at the NAW conference in Washington, D.C., and good to see you again. And thanks so much for your time, and thanks for joining DCKAP's Driven podcast.
Yeah, that event, the NAW's annual executive summit was fantastic. They're getting better every year. And I remember our conversation, Karthik. It was terrific. And I'm really excited to be here today and speak with you again.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, in this Driven podcast, I want to focus on two things. One is writing, because you're a great writer, and two is innovation. You do a lot of innovation, or you advise a lot of distributors on innovation. So I just want to focus this podcast on writing and innovation. But let me start this with writing. So tell us about the Mark Dancer on Flourishing Business. I enjoyed reading your newsletters on Substack. I recently subscribed to it as well. So what inspired this initiative, and who's your audience?
I was a consultant for a long time, and I don't do that anymore. I stopped consulting when the tools that I had, I felt were just terrifically outdated, given all that's happening with data and digital technologies and the epic changes that we're going through. And so, I'm at a point in my career where I'm just trying to make a difference, right? I'm trying to make a contribution where I can. And somehow I found my way to Substack as a platform for writers, and I was very intrigued by their mission, the importance of writing and the importance of reading. And so I just started writing. I'm not a natural writer. I'm an engineer by education. I think about making a difference, in two ways. One, I really believe that distribution and distributors really have the right stuff to help us as a society and as businesses and as workers, to help us get through all of the epic challenges and changes that we're experiencing. And so part of my mission is to kind of unlock some ideas that can help distributors achieve that potential. And then I'm also just looking for anyone I can help individually, a business, a person. If I get, if I keep writing and it's worthwhile and it's useful, and I can just spark, one new company, one new idea, I'll feel pretty happy.
That's awesome, Mark. One new company, if you're able to influence, that's awesome, right? I think that makes a big difference. So, Mark, there are a lot of influencers today, and everybody wants to be an influencer. And you are a writer, and you also produce videos, and you also speak at events. How can people grow their influence by writing or producing videos or speaking? What's the process like? Let's say there's an aspiring writer out there, and they want to grow their influence. How can they do that?
Yeah, boy, first you got to be a writer. If you want to be a writer, you got to be one, which means I think you need to write every day, right? To hone your skills. And you should have an editor. You should give feedback. You should listen to podcasts, right? That sort of thing. And then I think you mentioned influencers. I think you've got to decide, well, it's not really decide. You have to know the part of your work, which is writing, which is a craft and is an art, and I think should be purpose driven, and you can kind of develop that. And then there's the influencer side of it, which is really about marketing and building presence. And those two things are different. One is the act of writing, one is the business of writing. And I think as a writer, I personally start with the act of writing, and I'm not very good, frankly, at the influencer side, which is marketing and building my base. So I think there's two things. One, you need to have a formula. I'm inspired by a book called The Nexus by a gentleman named Julio Tino with a famous designer named Bruce Mao. And his idea is that to solve the great problems we have today, we need a convergence of art, science, and technology. So I try to do that in every single edition. The art of writing, the art of videos, leverage AI, leverage technology. I think you need that. And then you need to figure out, sponsors or funding, which is a harder thing.
Interesting. What is the process you follow with respect to writing? You said you write every day, but how much do you write? And what is the process like, right? Because I think you publish a newsletter once every 2 weeks. And
Yes.
what is the process like? Where do you come up with these ideas? Like, for instance, you got to get something out every 2 weeks. The reason I ask this is, I also try to write. And what is the process you follow like for writing?
Yeah, so I used to write every week. For a time, I wrote twice a week. I've got about like almost 200 editions out now. And recently, I kind of slowed down my pace to make it every other week. And that's because writing is, I think it's much more than the act of putting pen to paper or fingers to a keyboard, right? Writing is about listening, right? So you have to think about where you want to draw your inspiration, where you want to draw your research, and you have to access that by reading or listening and then talking. You have to have a conversation. And I do that kind of thing continuously, right? Every moment of every day, I'm trying to think about that in my personal conversations or things that are more kind of related to my profession, that sort of thing. Out of that, I craft an idea. I have a little tote board of like 5 ideas, but I'm really just work on one idea for 2 weeks. Then eventually I start putting thoughts on a keyboard. Sometimes that's in little snippets. I'll write a paragraph here and there. But once I feel like I've got it in my head, I sit down and write it kind of end to end. I send it through Grammarly as an AI check. ChatGPT has a creative writing assistant now, and I use that. And then when I think it's ready, I send it to, I have a professional editor, somebody who's edited some of my books and has worked with me on all of my edition. She knows my voice, my style, what I'm trying to accomplish. And so she fixes grammar and things like that, which are hopefully pretty well taken care of with the AI tools. And then she helps make sure I'm on strategy. And then once you do that, you've got to get it out there. So writing also includes publishing it and sharing it and asking your readers and others for feedback, right? That's the process. I also say this. I've been reading about the act of writing and how to live a life as a writer, because that's kind of what I'm trying to do now. And I believe, I have a personal life. I have a partner, Carol, and like in all relationships, you have to work on them all the time. And so part of my philosophy of being a good writer is to be a good partner. I think that the act of listening and processing those thoughts and having a conversation, which are essential for writing, are also essential for life, for relationships. So, I can't think about, I'm going to go away and write and, all by myself. It has to be part of living. I think being a better writer makes me a better partner and a better friend, and a better family member. And I think being a better partner, friend, and family member makes me a better writer.
That's awesome. It's not one or the other. It is everything together. So very interesting, Mark, and thanks for sharing your writing secrets. Do you also journal every day? I'm just curious, because I see a lot of writers journal as well. So do you journal?
A little bit. I have iPhone and they have a journaling thing. And when I'm out walking around or in the world, if I've got that with me and I have an idea, I journal it. It's pretty automated, not completely, right? I also have a written notebook that I carry around, and because sometimes my writing process is that I have to draw pictures. I'm an engineer and I think about systems. So I have to draw 2, 3, 5 things and show how they interact. So I do that in pen, in paper, because it's a little bit easier.
I think pen and paper makes a lot of sense. I do write with pen and paper as well. And sometimes, when you're traveling on the plane, something strikes and then, hey, you immediately jot it down. So that really helps me. That's something I've found it to be very helpful, because once you have the idea, it's easy to construct the story. But then you have the idea, then you forget it, right? Then, if you don't write it.
Yeah. I love ideas. I'm addicted to ideas. I get a little bit of endorphin or something hit every time I have an idea. So if I don't write them down, I'm searching for the new one all the time. So I need that history. The other thing, I wrote an edition, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 back about, I was inspired by a podcast I was into, which is on the science of reading, right? And they were contrasting it with social media reading, which is quick and snippy and that sort of thing, with really deep, immersive reading with a physical book, right? And they said that when you read that way, when you're really kind of involved in the book or the article, whatever you're reading, it fires every center of your brain, every physical corner of your brain. and it leads to new thoughts, right? So the one of the other principles of writing, I think, is that you're actually connecting with your readers' brains, right? And you're trying to, for me, it's by having a little bit of art, the images I create now with AI and sometimes with my camera, a little bit of technology, and thinking about the science of reading and writing. All of that is designed to energize my brain and my readers' brains. That's a little nerdy answer, but it's true, I think.
Sure, you talked about reading and readers are leaders. How important is reading to writing? How do you correlate?
Fundamental. Yeah, I mean, you can't be a good writer if you're not a good reader. That's your craft, right? You're creating things to read. So I have a couple of approaches. I like to read novels, because that's fiction and I write nonfiction. I struggle a little bit with reading sometimes because when I start reading a book, I'm wondering where it's going. And my mind starts wandering and I stop reading, right? So I listen to podcasts and I find the books I read through that because I feel like I know the author and what they're trying to accomplish. And then when I get into the book, I'm kind of more engaged on a personal level. I also, on my iPhone, I have a little group, of things I read. And I've got the Journal, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and then a number of fellow newsletter writers and some other things. And I scan those, but that's not really reading, right? When I want to read for effect, I make sure that I, slow down, get rid of distractions, and put my mind to it.
Yeah, deep work. So you talked about marketing a little bit. A lot of people write, but how important is marketing for a writer? And how does one become a better marketer, right? So for instance, hey, I write, obviously I want my writing to be read across the world. I want a lot of people to read it. So what is the process and what do you do to make that happen?
Yeah, so I need help there, actually. It's because I like writing. I like that process. I'm a little bit addicted to it. And the business of writing, the business of being a writer, I sometimes feel like that's a distraction to my writing. So I look for help, right? And Substack as a platform, I would give them plenty of kudos. They have lots of resources and they're building. They only make money if you make money, right? So you can publish for free, a free newsletter edition there forever and never pay a dime for using the site. So they want you to be able to get paid subscriptions, to have patrons, that sort of thing. And so there are a number of streams that they have where you can read about how to become the business of writing, I would say. And you can also connect with other writers through Substack and get their advice. That's all very important to me because I'm not natural in the business of writing. And then the other thing that I'm doing recently is I'm not really looking for sponsors per se. I've done a ton of presentations over the years for companies, vendors who supply the industry, where I would get paid to do a webcast, but I'm kind of just eye candy there. I attract people. What they really want is the list of people who attend, so they can market to them. I'm looking for patrons, and humbly, in the way that Da Vinci or Michelangelo had a patron who not only helped fund their work, right, but actually helped them try to become better writers through their network, the people that they can introduce them to, helping them with skills, helping them with technology, that sort of thing. And so my idea is that if I focus on writing and I'm true to my mission, and I can leverage Substack for some resources, and I can find some patrons who really like what I do and want to help me be a better writer, help me be more effective. That's kind of how I'm moving forward to do a better job at the business of writing.
No, I really like how transparent you are in terms of what you're doing and what is that you're looking for. Hey, I need patrons. I think that's really well said. And a lot of writers, I'm sure, can take inspiration from that. And patrons do help writers. So I was reading one of your recent newsletters, The Power of Proximity. I thought that was very interesting. But one thing I found fascinating is you also started experimenting with videos.
Yeah.
I watched the whole video. It was actually well made. And tell us about that process, right? So, hey, okay, you're a writer, but now why videos?
Well, first, I really appreciate your feedback that the video was well made because I have this phobia about looking at myself, right? I think I'm a writer because I can read my writing and I can try to make it better myself and get feedback. But when I see myself as a video, in a video, I'm like, oh God, I stink. I just can't look at it. So your feedback that it's good is really helpful. I'm doing videos, one, because some of my readers, a lot of my readers tell me they prefer videos, right? They don't really want to slow down to read, and they can watch a video while they're driving. I guess they could listen. Sometimes a video is just the author or an AI tool reading what's written. So I'm trying to, to find my way in videos. And it's sort of, I'm applying this art, the convergence of art, science, and technology sort of thing. I bought a gimbal recently, so I can maybe walk around or give some movement in the videos. That's the technology side of it, right? The science side of it, I haven't found a lot yet, but I know I've read about how people connect mind to mind through reading. I'm looking for that in videos. And then I'm interested in the art of it. I'm a passionate, personal amateur photographer. I've spent a ton of money on cameras over the years that I don't use. I just use my iPhone now. And so I think that if I can, I don't know what my approach is going to be with videos. It might be just to say, hey, please read the article, but here's what inspired me. Here's my passion. I might have interviews with people that I embed in it. I might tell a story from some of my work as a consultant or in my life or why it's relevant. I don't want it just to be a recreation of video, of the written content. I want it to be complementary, and I'm trying to figure that out.
Well, it's very interesting, and you also get to watch the video in 1.5x speed. So let's say if I want to consume the content faster, it would help. And this is something my dad told me. If people start watching you over and over again, they'll start liking you, and you'll also start liking yourself more. So
Yes.
So that's something, I just thought that was interesting. Yeah, that was interesting.
Well, I'm a big believer in podcasts, because if you can, I have certain styles that I like and people that I like, and I rotate it. But I really feel that if I listen to somebody for an hour, I've learned something about them, right? And now and if I can watch them, so much the better, right? And I think that really helps me from figuring out what I want to write about, what my messages are, how to communicate through my videos. Huge fan of that.
Absolutely. And yeah, again, I have subscribed to Mark Dancer on Flourishing Business on Substack. I really enjoy reading your newsletters. And for the audience out there, I also highly encourage them to subscribe to your Substack newsletter. But let's switch gears a little bit, Mark. Let's talk about innovation in distribution. You are a NAW Fellow, and for the audience out there who are not very familiar with NAW, NAW is the National Association of Wholesale Distribution or Distributors. So what does a NAW Fellow mean, and what is your role there?
Well, first, I love NAW because they've allowed me to pursue my passion, through writing. I've kind of become a writer through NAW. So they have a lot to do with where I am today. NAW's old model used to be they had a research, well, they still have the research arm, but they used to, I think it's fair to say that publishing books and research was a business for them, right? They made money at it. That has been really hard over the last several years because people don't buy books like they bought anymore. So, I work very closely with Eric Copland, the CEO, but especially Bart Tessel, who is the Chief Innovation Officer at NAW, and with Patty Roush, who is the VP of Education and also runs the AEC. She's the Executive Director of the Association Executive Council, which are all the other industry associations that belong to NAW. So my fellowship has really evolved. I wrote a book on CRM. I wrote a book on becoming a digital distributor. I wrote a book on getting results from your digital investments. And then I wrote a paper and some other things too, but a paper on how distributors leaned in during the pandemic, not just to survive, but to help their customers survive, right? And that end trajectory, all the books before it, has kind of set me on my path to look for breakthrough innovations, right? Their distributors have a lot of resources that give them best practices, continuous improvement. But what we don't have, because distributors don't do R&D, there's no budget. There isn't a lot of if we open ourselves up to possibilities, what might our business become? Business model innovation can we be something radically different than we are today? So my innovation, my fellowship is a continuing conversation every 2 weeks. It might be a book someday, but really it's just evolving. And I'm looking for the ideas, the people who have the ideas and are making them happen. I think the ultimate purpose of distribution is to help us all live our lives and do our work, to help us flourish, right? And so that's what I do as a fellow. And our collaboration is I do what I do, they what they do, and we overlap enough that it's a really effective partnership. We're trying to achieve the same things for distributors.
It's awesome. And I love the term innovate to dominate. So can you tell us a couple of things from the book? How can distributors innovate to dominate? What are they not doing right now? Or what is that one thing they need to be doing?
Yeah, so that phrase came when I was working with Ruth Stadius and Trish Lilly when I wrote Innovate to Dominate. And we were just talking about our findings, the work I was doing. And I was like, I really want distributors, they have a really tough business model because they are intermediaries, right? So their price and their value is determined by their position in the supply chain or the value chain, right? And I was like, kind of remember saying, I want to break us out of that mold. We're always going to be an intermediary, but what can we do so that our profits aren't constrained? So that we're not adding value to products, but we're creating our own value through the things that we know, the suppliers that we know beyond our manufacturers, the people who have knowledge and resources and skills and tools. And so we were talking about that, and I would probably credit Ruth Stadius and Trish Lilly, but the title popped out of that, Innovate to Dominate. Let's be bold. Let's aim high. Let's think about not just adding value to products, but dominating in our marketplace.
Yeah, dominate. I love the way you say dominate, right? So I think it really dominates, yeah.
I also think it's a better D word. I'll be a writer here for a second. There is disruption and disintermediation, right? Both of those are done to distributors. So, distributors, by definition, a disruption is done from the outside. Disintermediation is manufacturers not using distributors as much anymore, right? So we need our own D word, something we can do, and that's dominate, right? And I think we have the right stuff for doing that as I said earlier, with all that's happening.
Yeah, you work with a lot of distributors. Can you just share a couple of examples where distributors are innovating and dominating?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. There's a long list, right? I've worked, so first, a little context. I think distributors are doing great things with artificial intelligence and data, and that in the future, data is going to be more important than products. So we're moving in the right direction there. But the distribution business model has something really unique. In the United States, distributors are an $8 trillion industry. That's a third of the economy. But they're not Amazon. Distributors have branches and people in every community working side by side with the customers they serve. Distributors are local, real world businesses. So I would say that dominating comes from culture, right? Culture is human centered. It's person to person, right? I've written about Material Handling Inc., which is a regional distributor of material handling equipment. Mike Sane has helped me out quite a bit. When they interview, for candidates, they ask them where they're contributing their time. What are you doing? Where are you giving back? Because they want to import that culture into their business and then work with their customers that way. How can I help you? Doesn't, beyond the products that I sell, maybe just what can I do to help? I also would point to maybe Chuck Cohen and Benco Dental, right? They have the idea that as a distributor, they can write about the future of the dental industry, right? And that's a hard place for distributors to have credibility sometimes, right? Because we don't manufacture the products and we're not dentists. But they're building a culture around having a high percentage of their products being invented in the recent years, and offering papers, putting it out there in print on what they think the future of dentistry is. I went to a new periodontist recently to have my gums checked, and he asked what I did, and I told him. And then I said, so do you know Benco Dental? And he did. And he said, yeah, they're very innovative. To me, that's dominating, right? I think in the future, if I go just a little bit longer on that, we need to have our own point of view on how data and artificial intelligence will lead us to dominate, right? What we're doing right now is building confidence, letting our systems talk to each other, using it to help us be more productive in every function. All that's inside. I don't really know, and there probably exists, but I don't know a distributor yet who's using AI to create value in the customer's business, right? We're using it to create value in our business, I think, for the most part, right? When we do that, we will lead the data revolution forward and dominate.
Oh, very interesting. Dominate innovation, and it's also about process innovation, right? So it's not just about creating a product, or it's also about hiring, how you hire, hiring innovation, process innovation,
Yes.
being a thought leader. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I asked a distributor once, or they asked me first, then I asked another distributor, it's like, so what are we innovating? We can't innovate products because we don't make products, right? So it's a tough question. And I think it's process innovation, culture innovation, it's job definition innovation, and all that adds up to business model innovation, right? If I were to say, what should a distributor do right now, right? They should talk to their customers, ask them what their aspirations are, and then figure out how to help them do that. And the business model for that is a thing. You can read about it. It's called being an innovation intermediary. Right? I love that when I first heard this term because it's got intermediary attached to it. An innovation intermediary is any business that leverages what it knows and what it can do and its larger network to help another company innovate, right? So we are intermediaries of products. We're intermediaries of knowledge. Increasingly, we have relationships with universities. We can be intermediaries for services. And if we just listen to where the customers want to go and then work with them to get there, that will help us transform our business model almost overnight. We can do that tomorrow.
No, definitely. And I also think distributors can also focus a lot more on culture, and they can also focus a little bit or copy from the tech industry. Hey, what are the things they're doing well? You don't have to copy everything. But yeah, sometimes, one thing I do find is information is not really passed across every employee in the distribution company. So people don't know really what's happening. So I think, it's kind of nice if people get to know what's really happening within the company, within the industry, so people feel more empowered to work with their customers.
Well, in Stanford University has a great podcast called The Future of Everything. It's about science and technology, all kinds of applications. I haven't listened to it yet, but I noticed that their most recent episode is on the science of culture. I think that distributors and our ecosystem, should really hone into that because we're people-centric businesses, right? And we can do that with excellence, and that will lead to innovation.
Awesome. You're also a part of the Twin Global Network. What is the Twin Global Network, and what is your role there?
Yeah, so TWIN stands for the World Innovation Network. Rob Wolcott, who's an associate professor at Chicago and Northwestern, is the co-founder. And I found him as a resource when I started thinking about business model innovation in my books for NAW years ago, and I brought some of his knowledge into it. TWIN is like it's a volunteer network of really world-class innovators and people who want to tell their story. So there's people there from the forefront of technology, IT, from space, from healthcare. They have winning documentarians who are there, people that do design thinking and design in practice. And Rob gets them together once a year, usually at a big annual event. And then he does these expeditions. There was one recently in Africa. People go because they're curious and because they're innovators and they want to help other innovators be innovators. For me, as I started going to this, I don't know, 5, 6, 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the one body that was not represented was distributors and the supply chain. So I've been working on getting some to go for years. And last year, Benj Cohen, who has Proton AI, went with me. He's the son of a distributor and he's creating AI for distributors. And then Max Meister of Ludwig Meister, an industrial distributor in Germany, came with me. So I hope to draw, more. And actually, Kathy Mazzarella, spoke during COVID at a completely virtual event to about 30 or 40 twinians, as they call themselves. So it's inspiration for me and for others. It's networking, it's getting help. It's just world class. And it's one of my major resources for the work that I do, maybe the major resource.
That's awesome. Thanks for representing distribution in the Twin Network. Mark, you worked as a lieutenant in the US Navy for over 6 years. So it's very interesting. So how has that experience helped in your business career?
Yeah, so it was very formative. I went to the Naval Academy and I served in the fleet, as they say, way back in the Reagan years. It's I had several takeaways from my military experience. One is mission. So I'm very episodic in that when I was a consultant, it was perfect. It's why I gravitated to consulting, because you got a mission. You do it for 3 months or 6 months, and then you're on your next mission. And writing a newsletter every 2 weeks is like that too. In the Navy, in the U.S. military in general, it's not the officers that get things done. It's the enlisted folks, right? And so I learned very quickly that you need to treat them as experts. Find out what their job is and treat them as an expert in that job. And my job was to make them successful with resources and to hold them to standards. But that is where the Navy's culture comes from, right? I also did nuclear propulsion. That was fun. So I learned how to operate nuclear reactors at sea, and that's a whole other discussion. But that really helped me with my systems thinking, I guess, and to see things operating as a total system and know how to deal with it when things aren't going well. So that was my
Very
Navy.
interesting. Yeah, and a few last ending questions. For our driven podcast, we interview a lot of leaders, and the last leader we interviewed, right? So this is a question we always like to ask, or we just started asking recently, is what is one question you want to ask the next person we interview? So the last person we interviewed was Mulyadi Gio. He's from Indonesia. He's the CTO of a company called Circlo. And the question he wanted to ask is, leadership or being a leader sometimes is lonely at the top. So how can you not be lonely? So how do you respond to that?
Therapy, maybe. I'm actually looking for a therapist as kind of a co-pilot for my life. We'll see if that works. But I think that, we're doing so many things in the digital world which is virtual, right? And so I think every business leader should be thinking about how their business advances the human condition. And they should have the skills to do that. And if they do that, at the core of the human condition is relationships and and borrowing from Arthur Brooks, who spoke at NAW a couple of years ago, he says that happiness comes from three things, and I'm going to paraphrase, I'm sure I'm not going to get it quite right here, but happiness is from relationships, purpose, and accomplishments. Right. And so if a distributor leader applies Arthur Brooks' thinking to how does their business advance the human condition, and they're working on relationships and they're working on all that flows from that, that'll help them not feel lonely. Right. And it's tied to their business. So they don't have to think, oh, I got to go away from my business and do something to not be lonely. I think they should do it in their business. So how does your business advance the human condition? How does that lead to your happiness and theirs?
Yeah, having a sense of purpose, like you rightly said, right? So, you get driven by purpose. And also another thing I find helpful is maybe even having an executive coach. You talked about therapy a little bit, but so having an executive coach might also be helpful. So you can just bounce off ideas and get feedback.
Yeah, I guess you could use Pi, which is a verbal-oriented AI, right? And talk to Pi every day. But, for me, artificial intelligence, right, said now, at least in that sort of large language model kind of thing, I know it does really great things elsewhere, but it's kind of like a junior consultant, it really wants to help and it's kind of earnest, but it isn't human yet. So you need a real human to help you.
So Mark, now it's your turn, right? So what question would you like us to ask our next guest?
Well, I have a question. And I would love it if you would ask this, because I'm thinking about making this question I'm going to share with you kind of like an innovation challenge almost, or it's a question I'm going to try to answer in a lot of my editions, a lot of my conversations over the next year, right? And that question is, if you as a business person or an innovator, whoever you are, whatever industry, if you could access the the vast store of data, which is in the supply chain from one end to the other globally, from a manufacturer to a customer to all the intermediaries, they all have data. It's about how business is done, right? If you could access that data, how would you use it to create social impact and economic development, right? So by social impact, I mean things like electrification, wellness, solving the obesity and drug epidemic we have, helping skilled workers survive and thrive, and economic development, I mean, in the community that you serve, how do you help it grow and prosper, right? So this is a really big question, and I want to really ask it in distribution, the supply chain, but also outside, because I would like people that are maybe in policy positions, in government positions, other industries, but not distribution, social impact organizations, which are not the .orgs, right? The charities. I'd like them to say, all that information is there. It's great for commercial reasons, buying and selling stuff. But if the supply chain is going to be worthy of our times, it could also help us grow our economies and develop our societies. So that's my question. How can we use the vast store of data in the supply chain, a wish list, to create social impact and economic development?
Yeah, how can you harness data for social impact and economic development? A great question, Mark. Mark, I would like to end with this question. So what book are you reading right now?
Can I give you two? You can
Yeah,
probably
sure.
tell I'm being challenged on short answers. I'm reading two books. One is called Two Like the Lightning. That is by, the author is Ada Palmer. She's a professor at the University of Chicago, a historian. She writes about the Enlightenment. She writes about Vikings, Viking mysticism in her professional life. And then she writes sci-fi and fantasy books. I heard about her on another great podcast, Conversations with Tyler. So I'm going to read that just because I heard her talk. I was fascinated by the things she said. It's fiction. I don't read enough fiction. The other book I'm reading is The Creative Act, A Way of Being. So I'm trying to be a writer, and then writers are artists. Writers are creative. And this is by Rick Rubin, who is a very famous musical producer, starting with rap. He also does Adele and Johnny Cash and so many others. And he has a podcast called Tetragrammaton, right? But his book is about, it's very easy to read. You can pick it up, put it down, come back to it. It's about we all can be creators. Creators is just not the province of whatever an artist is. So I'm going to read fiction and I'm going to try to be an artist. Those are my two books.
That's awesome. I love that. And it's been a while since I read books in my mother tongue, which is Tamil. So this is the book I'm reading, so it's actually a book called Arthamulla Hindu Madam, or, just talks about Hinduism. Can you apply the facts of Hinduism in your daily life? It's written by a great writer called Kannadasan. He's no more. But I think, it's about 10 volumes and I'm in the third volume right now. It's an interesting read, but it also kind of helps me get back to my roots a little bit. So yeah, I kind of...
I'd love to chat with you sometime about that. I also look at Stanford's Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, and I read the founders or co-founders book, Fei Li, her book her journey through AI, because I think that, we need distributors, and especially, can lead the way towards human-centered artificial intelligence, and spiritualism and understanding different faiths is part of that. So I've been doing some investigations, some readings about that. I know very little about it, but if you'd like to chat about it sometime, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Yeah, I would love that, Mark. Mark, I just want to say a big thank you, right? So thank you so much for your time. You were very, very generous with your learnings. You shared a lot of great info. Like I started this conversation, when you surround yourself with very smart people, you get a little more smarter. That's how I feel today, right? So I really, I feel a little more smarter chatting with you. Thanks for sharing a lot of learnings. You shared a lot of great names, a lot of great podcast references, a lot of great writers. And you also shared some of your secrets of how to be a writer. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark, and thanks for joining the DCKAP's Driven podcast.
Thank you. I was happy to be here, and I appreciate all the kind words and big thoughts you had for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And one more thing. If you have not subscribed to the Driven podcast, please click the subscribe button. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It was a great conversation with Mark Dancer. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Driven Podcast. Check out our other episodes for more and subscribe to be the first to access every new episode.